Hi, fourth grade. In the Wild Robot Escapes, we're going to start with chapter 58 today. You can listen along with me. Make sure you're paying attention, and there will be a comprehension question or two for you to answer after today's reading. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 58, The Cabin. The hailstorm was brief but violent. Its icy stones were quickly melting, but the damage would linger on. The valley was littered with shredded leaves and wildflowers. Wounded animals were hobbling back in their homes. Several unlucky birds lay limp in the grass. Inside the cabin, Roz was standing by the window. She held Bright Bill in her arms, his bruised body wrapped in an old blanket. The robot knew everything was to know about caring for animals, but all her son needed was time. His injuries would heal on their own. "Go without me, Ma," said the goose in a weak voice. "I'll catch up to you when I'm feeling better." "That is ridiculous," said the robot. "What kind of mother would I be to leave her injured son behind?" "But, Ma—" "Stop talking," interrupted Roz. "You need rest." Brightbill tried to argue, but he was already falling asleep. The cabin was simple, just a square room with a wood stove, 2 chairs beside the table, a couple of cots rotting in the corner. Dusty mugs and bowls sat on the shelf, otherwise the walls were bare. It was clear no humans had been there for a very long time. However, it seemed that some of the creatures had moved in. The whole place had a foul odor. Lumps of feces were strewn about, and little footprints trailed away from the dark hole in the floor. Roz leaned over the hole, and in the language of the animals, she said, "Hello? Is anyone down there?" Something moved, and then a pair of shining eyes looked up from the darkness. "Who are you?" said the voice. "I didn't invite you into my home." "I'm so sorry to intrude," said the robot. "My son and I were having escaped the hailstorm." "Your son?" said the voice. "Is that him in your arms?" "Let me see." Very gently, the robot lifted the fold of the cloth and revealed a sleeping goose. "He must take after his father," said the voice. "He is my adopted son," the robot explained. "My name is Rob, and this is Brightbill." The shining eyes blinked, and the voice squeaked with excitement. "You're Roz and Brightbill? The birds have been singing about you for months. You're living legends." "Technically, I am not living," said the robot. "You seem pretty alive to me," said the voice. "Either way, it's nice to meet you. They call me Sprinkles." With that, the creature crawled up the hole and in the floor and was covered in black fur from her nose all the way to the tip of her fluffy tail. Well, except for those white stripes running back down her back, you see, Sprinkles was a skunk. Robot took one look at her and stepped backward. Sprinkles frowned. "You know, Roz, skunks only get stinky when they're nervous." "Are you nervous now?" "Well, sort of, but in a good way. I'm honored to meet you. Please pull up a seat and tell me what brings you here." Sprinkle hopped on the table and listened to Roz and described their journey. The skunk was a very good listener. While Roz spoke, Sprinkles nodded politely and said things like, "Oh my, is that right? And you don't say," and went on until Brightbill began to stir. "Ma, I'm thirsty," he whispered. "There's a creek right back there," said Sprinkles, "and those might be useful." She motioned to the bowls on the shelf. "Please help yourself to anything. My home is your home." It turns out skunks can be quite hospitable. Sprinkles invited the visitors to stay as long as they liked, and so our friends spent Brightbill's recovery in the cabin. The goose mostly slept. The robot brought him water and food. The skunk made sure both were comfortable. A few mornings later, the sunlight streamed in through the window and onto Brightbill. He was squawking and waddling and fluttering through the cabin. His injuries had healed, and he was eager to continue their journey. "Thank you for everything, Sprinkles," the robot weaved as she marched away from the cabin with her son on her shoulder. "Glad I could help," called the skunk. Misunderstood creatures like us gotta look after each other. That's a very nice skunk. Chapter 59, The Strange Wilderness. Here's the picture on that. Another gloomy day had settled over the mountains here and there, and the sun broke through the clouds, and the bright streaks came shining down like spotlights. One of those bright streaks swept over the rugged mountainside and found our friends. For the moment, the robot and the goose basked in the warm sunlight, and then a patch of light moved and rolled into the next valley, where it sparkled across a strange industrial site. A patchwork of large boxy structures were nestled among the trees. Broken walkways clung to the walls. Ramps and pipes slanted up the holes in the ground. The robot's computer brain identified the site. It was a deserted coal mine. This was a strange kind of wilderness. Scattered throughout the mountain ranges were ghosts of human activity. Overgrown railways, rusted automobiles, spindly towers perched on mountaintops, faded signs with messages like no trespassing and no hunting. It seemed like humans had once lived there and worked in this wilderness, only to leave it all behind. In places, though, there was still activity. Robot activity. Army of robot workers methodically dug new tunnels, built new dams, worked in new mining operations. They took down abandoned buildings, hauled away truckloads of litter. Our friends were curious about these working robots, but they kept a safe distance and went on their way. Chapter 60. Crack! A gunshot echoed through the mountains. There weren't many hunters willing to trek into the wilderness, but those who did were serious. They camped out, wore camouflage, fired traditional rifles for the sport of it. Crack! Roz and Brightwell were desperate to stay clear of the hunters. However, it was proving to be difficult. The trees were tightly packed together, and undergrowth was tough and tangled. So they followed the deer paths that cut through the parts of the forest, but they never knew when their next shot would be fired. Crack! The gunshots were growing louder. Our friends slowed to a crawl, afraid of being seen and heard, and then the chatter of forest animals fell silent. Crack! A bullet whizzed through the undergrowth, and a deer went bounding away. At the same time, birds screeched and flapped into the air. Unfortunately, one of those birds was Brightbill. Scared and confused, the young goose fluttered up to the tree limb just as two hunters emerged from the bushes. "What's a goose doing alone in the mountains?" said Hank, staring at Brightbill. "And what's it doing in a tree?" "There must be something wrong with it," said Miguel. "Maybe you should put it out of its misery." Hank reloaded his rifle. We're here to hunt deer," he said, "but it looks like we're having a goose for dinner." Had the hunters known Brightbill the way we do, reader? I'm sure they would have left him alone, but they knew nothing about him. To them, Brightbill was just another goose, a meal, and they were getting hungry. I like when they ask the reader questions in this book. The hunter raised his rifle. He took a deep breath. His finger reached for the trigger. And then, what will happen? A fierce gust of wind suddenly blew across the forest floor. No, not wind. Footsteps. Something was stomping towards the hunters. The rifles were ripped away, bent in hooks, and thrown aside. The men had hunted all manner of beasts, and they'd never come across this. Well, they didn't know what this was. It looked like a tree stump, standing on two long roots with branches hanging from its sides. The men stumbled backwards, eyes and mouths wide open. Then they turned and ran, and their terrified noises trailed off through the leaf litter. What in the world happened? The goose was terrified too. He slumped off his branch and into his mother's arms. The poor bird was trembling with fear, but he was unharmed. "I'm so sorry, Brightbill," said the robot. "I should have acted sooner. You are safe now. I promise." Chapter 61, The Guide. A little drizzle was falling on the travelers. Although they weren't actually traveling at the moment, they were standing still and staring up at the steep mountain of rocks. The robot had plenty of rock climbing experience, but one bad fall there and she would be stranded forever. So Roz carefully picked up her way up the slippery slope where the bright bow fluttered along beside her. They hadn't gone far when they came the sound of hooves clattering on the stone, and then the horned creature leaped from the mist, smashed right into the robot. Clang! Roz went flying backward. Clang! Roz crashed onto the ground. Standing on the rocks of the robot was a wild ram. He had big, curling horns. A crazed look in his eyes. Bright Blue flew into his mother's side and ready to defend her. Stay away from my mama, he hissed, spreading his wings. But rather than charging, the ram hung his head and started to cry. Oh, I'm so sorry, he blubbered. I don't want to hurt anyone. Sometimes I just lose control and smash things. I feel awful about it. Really, I do. Raj brushed herself off and I believe those are your instincts, she said. We all have them. They can be very powerful. I only hope your instincts do not end up breaking me. Don't worry, the ram sniffled. I will try not let my instincts to break you. I appreciate that, said the robot. My name's Thud, said the ram. Which way are you headed? We are trying to find our way out of these mountains, said Roz. But they never seem to end. You're almost there, said Thud. Let me show you the way. It's the least I can do after almost smashing you. The ram pranced away and led the friends to a narrow path that wound up the rocky mountainside. Roz tried to stay close, but Thud was born to climb. He was easily scrambled by the steep slopes and vanished into the mist. A minute later, his friendly voice called out, For a creature without hooves, you're not a bad climber. And there he was, peering down the cliff ledge. The path opened up the foggy meadow where the whole flock of wild sheep were grazing. They reminded Roz and the cows grazing in the pasture, and she wondered how the hilltop farm was doing without her. Thud pranced to the flock. These are my friends, he announced without stopping. They're lost, and I am guiding them off the mountains. The sheep raised their heads. Thud had made it a habit of making weird friends, but these two were definitely the weirdest. The flock watched them as the ram and the robot and the goose continued up the mountain and disappeared into the mist. Higher and higher they climbed above the tree line and to where only the rocks and scrubby plants and trickling mountain streams. They occasionally came upon a dirt road or a hiking trail, and the ram trotted across casually, while our friends crept across cautiously. At one point, the ram had a crazed look in his eyes. Again, his horns came flying at the robot as she jumped out of the way this time. Then Thud cried and apologized for his instincts. Roz forgave him, and the group carried on. Wow. There he is. There's Thud. They finally hiked up the mist and onto the mountain ridge above the sky that was clear, and below the blanket of puffy clouds spread outward in every direction. The sun was setting, and the western clouds were burning pink. Roz thought of the mountainside on her island. If only she could be watching the sunset from the peak instead of this one. But they still had a long, long way to go. Thud pointed our friends to one last path. This will take you down from the mountain through the foothills, he said, smiling. The ram suddenly got a crazed look in his eyes. Again, the robot prepared to jump, but this time Thud pulled himself together. He said goodbye to the travelers, and he pranced away. Now, boys and girls, go ahead into your comprehension question on your Google Classroom and answer today's question. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed today's reading.